Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. So, the sources we're digging into today tackle what is honestly the ultimate cold case. We're talking hundreds of thousands of years old. I mean, just picture this for a second. There was an actual moment in the deep past when at least 5 or 6 entirely distinct lineages of humans coexisted. They were sharing the exact same landscapes, literally looking right across the valleys at each other. But today, well, it's just us.
And that leads us to the big, emotionally charged question, doesn't it? Did modern humans kill off the others? If the answer is yes, if our ancestors deliberately and systematically eliminated every other human species out there, well, that's not just some quirky piece of ancient trivia. It's a massive, profound statement about our innate capacity for violence. It really forces us to ask if what we call human progress is actually rooted in something we'd much rather not think about: systematic genocide.
Because a crowded planet suddenly just emptied out. 6 down to 1. We went from a vibrant world bustling with Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, the so-called hobbits, and maybe even others like Homo luzonensis, down to a global population of exactly one species: us. So how does a planet filled with distinct, highly intelligent beings who used fire, buried their dead, created art, how does it just empty out? What actually happened to the others?
Okay, let's dive into this, starting with the absolute most famous of our lost cousins, the Neanderthals. The sources remind us over and over just how incredibly capable they were. I mean, they didn't just survive, they thrived across Europe and Western Asia for 400,000 years. They had brains that were actually as large or sometimes even larger than ours. They totally mastered the Mousterian tool industry, and they even cared for their sick and injured. And yet, roughly 40,000 years ago, right on the heels of modern humans arriving in large numbers, these totally resilient survivors just vanished. Now, you might be thinking the timing there is pretty suspicious, right? It naturally points to the direct violence hypothesis. That's this total war scenario where our ancestors just systematically eliminated the competition. It's a very cinematic idea, kind of like a movie plot. But here's the thing. When we actually look closely at the fossil record, it entirely lacks the sort of smoking gun evidence you would absolutely need to prove a continent-wide extermination campaign. Now, it is totally true that we do have some traumatized skeletal remains, but the evidence is, well, it's highly ambiguous. Think about it from a paleoanthropologist's perspective. When they find a cracked Neanderthal bone, it is genuinely difficult to tell the difference between violence caused by a modern human weapon, violence from a fellow Neanderthal, a simple hunting accident, or honestly just post-mortem damage caused by geological shifting over 40,000 years. So the absence of a clear smoking gun doesn't exactly prove we're innocent, but it does mean we absolutely cannot definitively prove that sweeping genocide hypothesis either. But wait, because the sources reveal a massive genetic twist here. Neanderthal DNA isn't just some microscopic trace of a bygone era. It is literally sitting in your genome right now. If you've ever taken one of those modern DNA tests, you've probably seen this. Somewhere between 1% and 4% of the DNA of every non-African modern human alive today is completely Neanderthal in origin. That means our interactions with them absolutely weren't just passing glances across a river or, immediate warfare. And that genetic legacy, it completely rewrites the whole total war narrative. Let's be real, groups engaged in a systematic, mutual extermination campaign do not consistently produce viable offspring over thousands of years across multiple continents. It just doesn't happen. The reality is that our relationship with them was incredibly varied. Sure, it was sometimes hostile, but it was also often surprisingly peaceful. This really forces an uncomfortable yet entirely fascinating question about the actual reality on the ground. Picture a mixed ancestry child growing up in either a Neanderthal or a modern human group. Now, we don't know these specific social dynamics of how they were treated, that's lost to time. But we do know for a fact that they survived, and they survived well enough to pass down genetic variants for immune function and metabolism that you and I are still using today. In a very real way, we absorbed their genetic strengths right in the process of replacing them. So what does this all mean? If direct violence isn't the whole story, we need to pivot our investigation to the silent killers. The evidence points heavily away from some cinematic total war and pushes us toward 3 combined forces that likely served as our alternative weapons: introduced pathogens, climate instability, and resource competition. Let's break these down, because together, they were far more devastating than any spear could ever be. The sources point out a pretty tragic reality. Our ancestors didn't actually have to carry weapons to carry death. Modern humans, as they were migrating out of Africa, brought completely novel pathogens with them, and the Neanderthals, having been isolated for millennia, they were totally disease naive. Think about the catastrophic mortality that followed European contact in the Americas. It was likely just like that. And a virus? Well, it leaves absolutely no trace in the fossil record. A Neanderthal who died from the common cold is going to look exactly like one who died of old age. And beyond disease, the landscape itself was literally turning against them. Between 40,000 and 28,000 years ago, the climate was incredibly unstable. It was wildly unpredictable. Modern humans just happened to have better competitive advantages for that specific environment. We had much larger social networks to fall back on during the lean times, and we developed long-range weapons like spear throwers and bows. That allowed us to hunt with significantly lower physical risk compared to the up-close ambush techniques the Neanderthals were using. In ecology, there's a term for this: competitive exclusion. Basically, we didn't necessarily need to hunt the Neanderthals down. The rule is, if two species compete for the exact same niche, the exact same caves, the same game, they just cannot stably coexist. A slight edge, just being slightly more efficient at extracting food consistently over millennia, is more than enough to drive the other population into marginal territories. And eventually, they just fade away through pure attrition. Now, if we shift our focus over to Asia, we meet the absolute most mysterious victims of this cold case, the Denisovans. Their physical fossil evidence is, well, it's almost non-existent. We're talking primarily just a single finger bone and a tooth found in a Siberian cave. That's it. Yet the DNA extracted from those tine fragments reveals this massive, vast hominin lineage that actually interbred with both Neanderthals and us. And here's the kicker. Even though the Denisovans vanished, they left us an incredible biological inheritance. There's a specific gene variant associated with adapting to high altitudes, which is heavily present in modern Tibetan populations today. And guess what? It is entirely of Denisovan origin. Every single time an athlete runs a high-altitude mountain marathon in the Himalayas, they are quite literally running on Denisovan biology that was left behind in our modern genome. How crazy is that? Expanding our lens even further, we find Homo floresiensis, famously known as the Hobbit. This was a completely distinct, small-bodied human species. They survived on the super-isolated island of Flores in Indonesia for hundreds of thousands of years. But right around 50,000 years ago, the fossil record for them just goes completely silent. And once again, you guessed it, the timing is deeply suspicious. They vanished right exactly when modern humans arrived in that region. However, we have to remember that island dynamics are a whole different ballgame compared to continents. Island ecosystems actually tend to accelerate extinction mechanisms. Think about it. The populations are much smaller and vastly more vulnerable to the sudden introduction of foreign diseases or direct competition for highly limited food resources. Throw in the fact that Flores had intense volcanic activity, and it just becomes this tangled web. We genuinely cannot be sure if the Hobbit fell to human resource competition, a devastating virus we brought along, or just an independent volcanic eruption that wiped out an already fragile population. So when we compile all the evidence from this prehistoric cold case, that neat Hollywood narrative of an organized extermination, it completely falls apart. The reality was profoundly messy. It was this incredibly complex web of introduced diseases, relentless ecological attrition, genetic absorption, and, yes, some occasional localized violence. We outcompeted them, we absorbed a tiny fraction of them, and ultimately we displaced them. Which leaves us with this final lingering thought to chew on. For most of the last 500,000 years, our way of being human wasn't the only way. There were other minds out there, other ways of experiencing the world, making tools, and looking up at the stars. The deeply uncomfortable, haunting reality is that out of all those distinct, beautiful variations of humanity, we are the only ones left standing. It really forces us to ask, what does our soul's survival actually say about who we are?